This is Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.
I would certainly see it's of huge historical significance because it's a great insight into what's going on in Protestantism, both as it develops from the Reformation and specifically as it's sort of swirling around England in the 17th century. So it's historically and theologically very important on that level.
Hello and welcome to Theology on the Go. I am Jonathan Master, joined as always by my friend and co-host, James Dolezal. James, how are you today?
I'm wonderful and looking forward to our discussion with a good friend of us both and former professor of mine, and on a topic that I took with him maybe 20 years ago, but still relevant to our concern.
We'll see how much you remember. Normally on this podcast, we will talk to authors of new books just to make our listeners aware of these books. But in this case, we're actually going to discuss an old book, The Doctrine of Justification by Faith by John Owen, but it's a new publication of that book. Soli Deo Gloria, an imprint of Reformation Heritage Books, has just reprinted this in 2023 with an introductory essay by our guest today, Carl Trueman, professor at Grove City College, writer, podcaster extraordinaire, and probably multiple-time guest on Theology on the Go. So, Carl, thanks for joining us today.
It's great to be back and always good to spend time with you guys, even if it's virtually.
Yes, it's better. It's better than nothing, but it'd be even better if we were in the room together. I wanted to start by asking a question about this Owen volume. Why did he write this book on justification by faith? What was it in the middle of the 17th century that was under attack, or did he sense was being strained exegetically or socially or theologically with respect to this cornerstone doctrine?
Yeah, that's a good question. Of course, there's both a longer context and a more immediate context of the book. I think the longer context is justification by grace through faith is a very important Protestant doctrine. I think it would be wrong to say that it was the doctrine that initially precipitated the Reformation, but it fairly quickly emerges as a central point of thinking in Protestantism, and it has implications not only for ecclesiology, for our understanding of the ministry versus the priesthood, these kind of things. It also has an effect on how we understand the sacraments to operate. And above all, perhaps, it has key central importance to how we understand the way we receive the grace of God, the way we are righteous before God, the way we stand, we're justified before a holy God. So for a Protestant to write on justification in the 17th centuries, on one level, is not unusual at all. I mean, that's a key Reformation issue. Of course, the articulation of justification in the Reformation in some ways raised as many questions as it answered. The whole issue of how do you tie together good works with faith? Where do good works play a role in salvation became one question. Another question, which you're getting into more technical territory, is the righteousness of Christ that we receive by faith. Is that all of his righteousness? Is it the work that he does on the cross, or is it the work that he does, from the moment his ministry is inaugurated up and through the cross and to the resurrection? So these are the kind of questions that were beginning to bubble up with some pungency in the middle of the 17th century, both in England and on the continent. And it's against that kind of background that Owen is writing his work. So there's a general, we might say, Protestant concern or Protestant polemic here, which we could trace back to the Reformation. And there are also things that are occurring, questions that have been raised precisely because of the Protestant doctrine that Owen is having to address, things that Calvin and Luther never addressed because they weren't issues, particularly in their day.
You say in the introduction that there's a broad anti-Pelagian consensus. And it would almost seem like, well, if everybody's an anti-Pelagian, then we're all going to come to terms on the doctrine of justification by faith. And yet it doesn't seem to shake out that way. What kind of debate, what kind of fissures are going on within anti-Pelagianism? I mean, even Rome itself, who Reformed often accused of being Pelagian, probably would not have thought of themselves that way, or at least openly denied that they were Pelagian in their sympathies. So how is this a sort of in-house debate among anti-Pelagians?
Yeah, well, when you think about Pelagian, one of the things that in some ways I think is a little confusing to Protestants, of course, is the way that a man like Luther casts the Reformation. And Luther very much presents himself as relitigating the dispute between Augustine and Pelagius in the ancient church. So Luther himself thinks that the battle against Rome is the battle against Pelagians, a battle against those who place too much authority or too much confidence in human ability, even after the fall. So it's a very powerful part of, we might say, Protestant mythology to think of the Reformation really as a reiteration of the battles of the early 5th century. In actual fact, it's a bit more complicated than that. It's complicated on a couple of fronts. One, Rome itself has a diversity of opinion on what we might call the dynamics of grace in the 16th and on into the 17th century. So within Rome itself, there'll be those who are pretty strict predestinarians, and there are others who hold, like the Jesuits, for example, who hold a position that will actually be very influential on the Arminians. The strict reform, people like me would regard as semi-Pelagian in many ways. So the whole Pelagius versus Augustine model, it's part of the mythology, but it's not a great guide to what divides Protestants from Catholics.
Because it divides Catholics from Catholics.
It divides Catholics from Catholics. The real issue dividing Protestants from Catholics is, for want of a better term, it's somewhat simplistic to put it this way. We won't say it's the content of justification, or it's how you get the righteousness of Christ. If I was sitting in this room now with Cardinal Bellarmine, greatest Jesuit mind of the late 16th century, and I were to ask him, do you believe that we are justified by the sovereign action of God and solely by the righteousness of Christ? Bellarmine would say yes. I don't think he would disagree with that formulation. But where we would really disagree is, okay, so how do I get this righteousness of Christ? Where does it come to me from? And Bellarmine, of course, would tie it very much to the sacraments and would see us receiving it by what we might call impartation. Now, impartation doesn't mean that it's like righteousness, like a physical lump within us, but it tilts that kind of way. That's not a wholly misguided way to think about it. Whereas a Protestant, say Owen, is going to argue, well, I agree with Bellarmino that we're justified by the righteousness of Christ, but it actually comes through grasping Christ by faith, not through the sacraments, and it is imputed to me. It's accounted to me. It's credited to me. It's not something that is sort of infused into me, if we can use that kind of language. So the Pelagian debate, we might put it this way, the Pelagian debate is about the framework of salvation, the eternal framework of salvation. It's about predestination. The justification debate is about how that salvation becomes a reality in the life of the individual. Both, I'm trying to think now of a Thomist, a Dominican in the 16th century, would probably agree with me pretty much on predestination, would probably agree with Luther and Calvin in the broad terms of how they understood predestination. But where he would disagree is, how is that predestination executed in time for you to get the grace of God? Does it come through the sacraments, or does it come through the preaching and the believing of the word of God? And that's the key difference.
And yet in this treatise, Owen's not just sparring with Roman Catholics, right? I mean, he's also sparring with, I don't know whether we should call the Socinians Protestants, if that's even the right thing. Certainly he would have regarded them as heretical. But then also in view are other Protestants, particularly his great arch critic on this point, perhaps Richard Baxter. Yeah. So how do we understand what Owen's doing, sparring sort of intra-Protestant skirmishes here?
Well, Socinianism really is a movement that it finds its origins in the thinking of a couple of Italians in the 16th century, but becomes very influential really in Poland of all places. It's a kind of odd thing that Socinianism starts in Italy, becomes very influential in Poland, and represents a kind of radical end of, if we want to use the word reformed, we're using it in a very, very generic way here, the radical end of sort of reformed Protestantism that really doesn't like what we might call today, doesn't like any kind of abstractions at all, doesn't like anything that isn't concrete. So, if you're going to be justification for the Socinians has to involve moral transformation. It really comes down to Jesus is a great example, and our justification comes down to us following Jesus' great example. So that's one thing that Owen is hitting against. In some ways, that's not a particularly tough issue to deal with. You get into Romans, there's some pretty straightforward exegetical arguments against the Socinians. Trickier is a man like Richard Baxter. Now, you've got to remember there's also an immediate English context here. In England of the 17th century, there's a lot of religious sectarianism. There's a lot of crazy stuff going on in the Protestant world. And there's a civil war that's taken place. A king has been executed. The world really does seem to be, we think about the world today seeming uncertain and unstable. It must have seemed much more so in the 17th century in England in the 1640s, 1650s, onwards in the 1660s. And a big question for a lot of the Puritan side of things, the Protestant things, is, where do works? We need a theology that doesn't allow people to just go off and behave in any crazy way they can. And with the best will in the world, as a committed Protestant, I have to say, the tricky thing for Protestantism coming from the Reformation is always the place of good works. It's why Catholics continue to press that issue polemically today. When they're still pressing, where do good works fit in? 500 years after they first pressed that point, that may not mean there isn't an answer, but it does mean it's a good question to ask. And Richard Baxter belongs to what we somewhat pejoratively call a sort of neo-nomian tradition within English Reform thinking. And it has variations, but essentially it argues that our justification is based upon the imputed righteousness of Christ, but the imparted righteousness of Christ also plays a role as well, that works are essential and also somewhat constitutive of justification. And that's what Owen wants to get at, because in Owen's mind, that's a very serious concession towards the kind of works righteousness that one finds in Catholicism. I think I want to be sympathetic to Baxter in terms of his concern. I think he's facing chaos in England, and he really does want to make sure that people understand that the gospel does not justify behaving in any way you want. It doesn't justify social chaos. On the other hand, I think I'm with Owen in thinking that he steps over that, he tilts too far the other way and renders the possibility of a kind of legalism to be a very, very real possibility within Christianity.
Is this the debate over the hot peppercorn, in which faith is almost something that we bring, tiny as it is, in our hands?
And that's very much Baxter's kind of position. Of course, that is the title of Hans Borsman's great book on Baxter on justification, which I disagree with actually at key points.
I think you wrote a book in response to it, as I recall.
Yeah, I did, and Hans is a good friend. There's no personal at stake in this. Though it is interesting to see where Hans has gone in the years since, that Hans has moved in a much more sacramental and participatory kind of direction on justification. And I've often thought that, you can see the hot peppercorn of that in some ways in his work on Richard Baxter. And I'm not saying anything to you there that I wouldn't say to his face. So I'm not, you don't have to edit that.
Or that we can't read out of his books, yeah.
You can't read out of his books, yeah. A very fine scholar, but we do disagree on this particular issue.
Carl, you talked briefly about neo-nomianism, or broadly speaking, neo-nomianism, Baxter, and what he represents. On the other side of it, Owen is concerned about antinomianism. Yeah. And so I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that concern. And we we can understand what he was worried about with respect to Baxter's theology.
Yeah.
What are his concerns with respect to antinomianism?
Well, in some ways, they're the same as Baxter's. Owen himself certainly doesn't want to articulate a view of justification whereby anything goes. And one of the things that's particularly concerning to these guys is the notion of eternal justification. And eternal justification, really what's happening when you think about predestination, we take up our salvation into eternity at that point. We think that the reason we have faith here and now is because God is elected in all eternity. What eternal justification does is it sort of takes up a bit more, and it actually takes up the fact that in its most extreme form, that God from all eternity has regarded the elect as righteous. And that transforms, of course, the notion of faith. If from the moment I'm conceived in my mother's womb, God considers me righteous, then what is faith? That moment when I'm converted, when I exert faith, what is faith? Well, faith really is sort of reduced at that point to the realization that I am what I always have been. And that raises all kinds of questions, not simply for works as it happens. There are all kinds of questions that raises across the board, but that really does then, this sort of doctrine really does then tilt towards fulfilling the Roman Catholic caricature of Protestantism. That, hey, if you're justified by faith, if it's all down to Christ's work, you don't need to behave in any particular way. You can just get on with life as it is. So Owen's concern is with notion of eternal justification. And if you wanted to look up a theologian, I think, who's a particularly fine advocate of the antinomian position, it would be Tobias Crisp. That would be the name that comes to mind. In fact, Baxter refers to Crispianism as his sort of target for the antinomian. So, as far as I know from reading about the life of Crisp, he was a godly man. I mean, Crisp was not some crazy, doing whatever he wanted, antinomian guy, but his theology took a lot up into eternity. And to put it in, I suppose, more technical terms, potentially really negated the significance of history and the significance of the Christian life. And like Baxter, Owen doesn't want to be over there either. I'm mindful as I give this answer of, I remember Martin Lloyd-Jones somewhere makes the comment to the effect, I think it was Martin Lloyd-Jones, that one's preaching should not be antinomian, but there should always be enough there for you to be suspected of antinomianism. That's, if you're going to err on any side, you're going to tilt slightly towards the free grace side of things.
Now, in Owen's, we're winding down in terms of time, but I just want to cover one or two more things. In Owen's Doctrine of Justification, the imputation of Christ's active obedience plays a vital role, and I wonder if you could articulate, because sometimes that's been a contested doctrine even today in Reformed circles. Why is it so important in Owen's presentation of the Doctrine of Justification?
Yeah, it's important because it was a hot button issue in the 17th century for the kind of reasons we've just been talking about. I've not really followed the debates relative to new perspective, et cetera, in the way it's bubbled up in more recent years. But in Owen's day, the imputation of both passive and active righteousness was seen, certainly by a man like Owen, as a way of really cutting off any possibility of the kind of neo-nomianism that you find in Baxter. That, one could say, summarizing Baxter's theology crudely, one could say that the imputation of the passive righteousness of Christ, the death of Christ, etc., gets us forgiveness. But there's need for more than forgiveness for full redemption. And I'm conscious here that I'm somewhat misrepresenting Baxter. I should probably say, the cruder versions of Baxter's theology as it plays out in the wider world could leave you vulnerable to thinking that just because it's only the passive righteousness that's imputed, there is something left that you have to bring to the table. You have to positively fulfill the law in order to be righteous before God. It's a big debate at the Westminster Assembly, and interestingly enough, the Assembly doesn't include the word whole relative to Christ's righteousness in the confession, because I think it's a consent. It wants to keep the advocates of single imputation on board. I think there are probably backroom discussions that we don't know about but can only speculate about, that are, because it seems that the double imputation guys win. They win the arguments, but they don't, they don't get the win in the document. Some deal is cooked up behind the scenes, which, by the way, as a Presbyterian, I find that very encouraging. I love it when I discover, I love it when I find pragmatism among the so-called godly, because it's very helpful for anybody operating in a presbytery today to know that sometimes you just got to get the deal done, But that's why it's a big deal in Owen's day, because single imputation would be seen as playing into the hands of the legalists, the neo-nomians.
But in the Savoy Declaration, right? I mean, Owen's own doctrinal statement is quite more explicit on this.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. And I think that's because that's Owen's declaration. You're not dealing with committees there. You're not wanting to keep people on board.
He and Goodwin agreed, and so that went into the document.
Yeah, they were, I can't imagine anybody disagreeing with them and getting away with it, to be honest. But,
so, Carl, last question. This obviously this is a reprint of an old book on an important topic. Is this a book that you would still put in people's hands today? Obviously, some of our listeners will be interested in it for historical reasons, and they love reading Owen, and they want to dive more deeply into some of these Puritan sources. But would it be one of your, I don't know, 3 or 4 go-to books on justification by faith, and even if not, where does it fit? Where does it have a significant voice or role to play?
I think, yes, it would be one of my 3 or 4. It might even be my top 1. I haven't asked myself that question for a while. I would certainly see it's of huge historical significance, because it's a great insight into what's going on in Protestantism, both as it develops from the Reformation and specifically as it's sort of swirling around England in the 17th century. So it's historically and theologically very important on that level. Secondly, I think Owen brings out, what he does so well is he shows how justification needs to be integrated with broader theological structures. The whole covenant structure, which has implications beyond justification, is there in the work. So I think it's a really good example of showing people how theology fits together. You can talk about justification, but actually that connects to your doctrine of God. It connects to your doctrine of how God has revealed himself and acts in history. It's very rich in terms of being an integrative sort of theological exercise on that front. And thirdly, as somebody who thinks he basically gets justification right, I'd want to say, it's a very important statement of the correct position on justification. Does it answer all the questions that have come up since? Does it address the sort of questions that somebody like N.T. Wright would want to raise about justification? Not really. And that's why we can't simply, I think, as theologians or pastors, just read Owen. We can't just be antiquarians at that level. But I think it's a useful place to stand in order to assess and think about the kind of questions that are being raised by thoughtful scholars like N.T. Wright and company in the present day.
Carl, thanks for giving us a few minutes of your time today to discuss this book and this essay. And again, we commend it to our listeners and appreciate your time with us.
Thanks very much. Been lovely to be on with you.
Our friends at Reformation Heritage Books have given us a few copies of the Doctrine of Justification by Faith, this reprint of John Owen's famous work with the introductory essay by our guest, Carl Trueman. And if you're interested in the possibility of winning a copy of this book, you can go to placefortruth.org or theologyonthego.org. There are areas there for you to enter your information, and we'd love to see this book in your hands. If you know anyone who might be helped by this podcast, please pass it along to them. Rate and review the podcast wherever you download it. That helps us get the word out. And if you're able to donate to the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, you can do that at alliancenet.org or placefortruth.org. And on behalf of James and myself and the whole crew here at the Alliance, thank you for listening to Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.